Are you really holding up the line for him? Someone scoffed as the flag rope clicked in the cold morning air, the sound cutting through the ferry terminal like a thin crack of frost. The sailors pressed their jokes a little harder, careless laughter breaking against the old veteran's silence, while the fogged windows caught the pale harbor light. Then a shy glint from the brass service coin on his chest lifted the room for a beat, quiet enough to hear his heartbeat in the stillness. Still quiet, men leave echoes too, and this one began with a single flicker of gold. The winter wind coming off the water drifted straight through the doors of the Willow Creek ferry terminal, carrying the kind of salt, cold breath that made folks pull their jackets a little tighter. The ferry horn sounded from somewhere beyond the fog, a long, familiar note that settled into the rafters like a memory. Walt Hensley stepped inside with the quiet care of a man who'd learned long ago not to take up more space than he needed. 68 shoulders, a little rounded from time and tide, he was known around town as that quiet old veteran, the sort who never bragged and never hurried. His boots tapped lightly on the tile as he joined the line for the morning crossing. A cluster of dockside sailors, ferry deckhands, and small boat regulars glanced his way. One of them chuckled, shaking his head. "If he gets any slower," he said loudly, "we'll miss the tide." A few others laughed along, not cruel so much as careless, the way people sometimes are when the day hasn't fully begun and patience hasn't woken up yet. Their laughter echoed off the metal benches and glass windows filling the chilly lobby. Walt didn't respond. He adjusted the strap of his canvas bag and kept his eyes on the faded sign above the ticket counter. The clerk, Karen, lifted her chin when she spotted him. "Sir," she called out loud enough for the line to hear, "if you're not fully ready, please step aside so others can move through." Walt paused as though deciding whether he'd misheard her. When she didn't soften her expression, he slowly unzipped his coat to reach for his paperwork. As he did, a small flash of gold caught the overhead lights, just a flicker, almost nothing. But it was enough for someone paying attention. A brass coin worn at the edges swung briefly from a thin chain inside his coat before he tucked it back against his chest. Noah Turner, 12 years old and waiting with his mother a few spots behind, blinked as he saw it. He wasn't sure what the coin was or why it glowed that way, but it made him tilt his head curious in a way only kids allow themselves to be. Sir Karen repeated sharper this time, "Please step aside if you're not prepared." Walt nodded once. "Of course," he said quietly, so quietly that only the two people closest to him heard it. The dockside sailors shifted boots, scraping the floor, impatience spreading through them like a small wave. One tapped his foot. Another exhaled loudly, arms crossed. Walt moved to the side with slow, deliberate steps, letting others pass in front of him. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply yielded the way a man does when he's learned that pushing against a rushed crowd never ends well. Noah watched him from behind the line, noticing the way the older man's hands trembled slightly as he found a place near the wall. He didn't seem embarrassed, just tired, as though the world had grown louder than he preferred. A gull cried somewhere outside, its voice thin over the steady hum of the terminal. And as the line shuffled forward, the crowd's restlessness didn't ease. If anything, it pressed a little harder, settling around Walt, like the weight of a cold morning tide refusing to let him forget he'd been pushed aside. The line crept forward with the slow rhythm of a tired morning. Walt stepped back into it, holding the folded ferry cargo form close to his chest, as though it might steady his hands. The print on the paper was small, tighter than he remembered it being, the last time he'd filled one out. His fingers trembled just enough to make the numbers blur. He tried again, leaning closer, studying each box like a puzzle he used to solve easily. Behind the counter, Karen tapped her pen against the desk, in a steady beat that sounded impatient even from a distance. When Walt finally reached her window, he offered the form with a hopeful nod. Karen scanned it once, sighed, and shook her head. Sir, this is wrong again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the way clipped words do in a quiet space. A couple of sailors in line exchanged looks. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in a weathered jacket, lifted his chin toward another. At the diner yesterday, he said, smirking. Some old guy couldn't even figure out the refill. Just stood there staring at the coffee like it was a foreign object. The others snickered, and the sound rolled across the terminal floor like loose marbles. Walt lowered his head and reached down to pick up a second sheet Karen had slipped back toward him. As he bent, something slid from the inside of his coat, a small brass coin heavier than it looked. It hit the floor with a muted tap and spun once before settling. This time the light caught it more clearly, revealing the etched ring of symbols along its rim. Noah saw it before Walt did. He stepped out of the line just enough to look at the older man. Sir, is that a service coin? Walt straightened, slowly slipping the coin back into his coat with a careful hand. Just something from the past, he said. It wasn't unkind, just final, the way someone closes a door on a memory they're not ready to explain. Before Noah could ask anything else, Karen spoke sharply. Noah, don't interrupt the line. Noah stepped back, but his eyes never left Walt. He noticed the way the older man's shoulders dipped, not in defeat, but in a quiet effort to stay composed. He noticed the wear on Walt's boots, the careful way he folded the cargo form again, the soft exhale that came from someone trying to get it right. Noah had been working all week on his social studies project, Local Heroes Week, a simple poster assignment the teacher said should highlight someone in town who made a difference. Most kids picked firefighters or shop owners or coaches. But Noah felt something shift as he watched Walt. Something about the coin, the modest way he carried himself, the patience in the face of strangers' jokes. It all felt like part of a story nobody else was telling. Walt moved back to the side counter to rewrite the form yet again. The overhead lights flickered faintly. Outside, the ferry horn called across the cold water, steady and familiar. Karen returned to her stack of paperwork. The sailors went back to their low conversations. But Noah kept glancing over, taking quiet mental notes the way a young reporter might, sensing that the quiet old man with the trembling hands wasn't just another traveler. He might be the hero his project had been waiting for. The lobby felt busier now, the morning rush settling into a restless hum that rose and fell like the tide outside. Walt stood near the side counter, rewriting the cargo form for the third time, his handwriting tightening as he tried to steady each line. The ferries coming and going cast long shapes across the floor whenever the doors opened, letting cold air sweep through the waiting passengers. He took a slow breath and moved back into line. Noah watched him from a distance, shifting on his feet, sensing the tension around the older man as the sailors whispered again. When Walt finally reached the counter, Karen stiffened. Sir, she said louder than before, you're slowing down the entire ferry schedule. Step aside again. A sailor behind Walt barked a laugh. We'll miss the tide waiting on this guy. The mockery spread quickly, headshakes, smirks, the kind of careless cruelty people let slip when they assume their words won't land anywhere that matters. Walt didn't turn around. He simply held the form out in both hands, trying to keep it from shaking. I'm trying, he said softly, but this one, it's for someone who doesn't have an address anymore. For a moment the line quieted just enough to catch the weight of his words. Noah leaned forward, listening carefully, but Karen didn't pause long enough to understand. She cut him off. Sir, please don't complicate things. We just need the correct address. Walt blinked once, the way someone does when they're deciding whether to keep speaking or let the moment pass. He folded the paper neatly and stepped away from the counter without another word. Karen exhaled sharply and moved to the next traveler. The sailors resumed their muttering. One shook his head. Another snorted, "Man can't keep up with a simple form." But Noah didn't look away. He saw the way Walt held the folded paper against his chest, as though protecting it from being misunderstood again. He saw the quiet dignity, the patience, the refusal to argue, even as the line pressed in on him. Walt reached the far end of the lobby near the big windows that faced the docks. Outside, the ferry horn let out a deep, lonely call. The sound filled the room, smoothing out the sailors' laughter, until only the echo remained. Walt paused there, half in shadow, half in the pale winter light, as the wind pushed through the door behind him and rattled the glass. His coat shifted slightly, and Noah caught a glimpse of the chain that held the brass coin beneath it. Noah's chest tightened. It wasn't just unfairness now. It was wrong. The boy felt that with a certainty he couldn't name something in the way Walt's shoulders sank, not from weakness, but from being misread again and again, as if the world had forgotten how to look past what was slow or quiet. Walt reached for the door. Noah's fingers curled at his sides. He didn't call out. He just watched as the quiet old veteran stepped outside into the wind, his silhouette swallowed by the gray light, drifting off the water. And for the first time all morning, the boy understood that something important had just been pushed aside, far more important than a ferry schedule. Noah hurried through the terminal doors, the cold air rushing against his jacket as he spotted Walt near the edge of the dock. The older man was moving slowly, shoulders bent against the wind rolling off the harbor. Fog drifted low along the water, blurring the boundary between sea and sky. "Sir, you dropped this," Noah called. Walt turned just as something slipped from his coat again. The brass coin hit the wooden planks with a bright, ringing tap, then spun across the weathered boards. It rolled in a widening circle, catching the thin winter light, until it glimmered like a sunbeam skimming the surface of the water. A hush fell over the handful of people nearby. One of the older sailors stepped closer, squinting, as the coin wobbled to a stop. "Is that," he breathed, "is that the '96 Coast Rescue coin?" The dock seemed to hold its breath. Even the seagulls circling overhead went silent for a moment, hanging in the air as though waiting. Noah's eyes widened. Walt didn't reach for the coin right away. He simply stood there, still and unassuming, as though the shining little circle on the ground belonged to someone else. Then footsteps approached, steady, deliberate, familiar to anyone who'd ever worked on the water. A tall man with silver hair and a long, dark coat stepped out from the fog, his posture straight as a mast, his expression unreadable. Henry Mason, retired. Coast Guard Admiral walked toward them without breaking stride. Someone whispered his name, and the whisper moved through the crowd like a ripple. The Admiral picked up the coin, turning at once between his fingers. He looked at Walt for a long, quiet moment, the kind of look that said more than most conversations. And just like that, without hesitation, without ceremony, the Admiral stepped in. Those exact words seemed to settle into the dock itself, traveling down the worn planks. He stepped in without a word. Karen stood behind Noah, frozen. "Mr. Hensley." "I didn't know," she murmured, her voice thin in the cold. A woman near the railing pressed a hand to her mouth. "My cousin was rescued during that," she said softly. "They told us a man with a coin like that saved him." Walt shook his head gently. "Just did what I could." The Admiral didn't correct him. He didn't embellish. He simply placed the coin carefully into Walt's hand, closing the older man's fingers around it, as if returning something sacred. For a moment it seemed Walt might speak, but the words never came. His breath caught slightly, not from emotion, he showed openly, but from the sudden attention pressing in on him. He wasn't slammed by anger, only by the weight of finally being seen. The sailors who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably, their eyes lowered. Karen's face flushed with something like shame. Noah stood a little taller, the wind brushing his hair back as he watched the scene unfold, with the reverence of someone witnessing a quiet truth being revealed. The Admiral kept his hand on Walt's for a heartbeat longer, then let go, stepping back with a nod that held more meaning than applause ever could. Trust had shifted. The tide had turned, and everyone on that dock felt it. The dock felt different when everyone walked back inside the terminal. The cold hadn't lifted, but something else had, something quieter, lighter, like a weight set down after being carried too long. Walt moved slowly toward Karen's counter, the brass coin resting in his palm, before he set it gently on the desk. Its warm glow softened the harsh fluorescent lights above. Karen cleared her throat, her voice lower now, steady in a way it hadn't been all morning. "Let me help you properly this time, Mr. Hensley." Walt gave a small nod and unfolded the cargo form again. The lines and boxes looked just as cramped as before, but this time they didn't feel like a test he was doomed to fail. Noah stepped up beside him, sliding into the space as naturally as if he belonged there. "I can help," Sir Noah said quietly. "If you want." Walt hesitated only a second. "I'd appreciate that." The boy smiled, taking the form and reading each line aloud, guiding Walt's answers with patient care. Karen handed over a fresh pen, no sighing, no tapping, just a respectful quiet between them. A few sailors approached, hats in hand, or held awkwardly at their sides. None of them smirked now. One of the older ones cleared his throat. "Sir, thank you for what you did back then." His voice carried a note of humility unfamiliar to the group that had laughed earlier. Another nodded. "Didn't know who we were talking about." Walt looked up, offered the smallest smile. "Most folks never need to." Outside, the ferry bell rang, one clear, resonant tone drifting in with the breeze. It echoed along the terminal walls, mingling with the faint sound of a church choir rehearsing across the street. Their voices rose and fell in soft harmony, slipping through the gaps in the old windows. Noah kept writing, pausing every now and then to make sure Walt agreed with each detail. The older man answered in short, thoughtful phrases, and together they made steady progress. Across the lobby, the community library's corkboard had a new poster pinned to it, Community Appreciation Week, in bold blue letters. A few people stopped to look at it, and then back toward Walt with a new kind of understanding. The brass coin lay on the counter beside the form, catching the afternoon light, as if it had found its rightful place. People approaching the line glanced at it, whispered, and then straightened their posture without quite realizing why. A sailor from earlier rubbed the back of his neck, chuckling under his breath. "Guess we all boarded the wrong line today," he said. The joke was gentle, offered like a peace token, and it made Noah grin. Even Karen allowed herself a small smile as she typed the final details into the terminal computer. "There," she said softly. "All set, Mr. Hensley." Walt thanked her with a nod, slipping the completed paperwork into his coat. The tension that had held the morning hostage had melted away, replaced with the warmth of people seeing each other differently than they had an hour ago. Outside, another ferry bell sounded, drifting through the terminal, like a reminder that the day still had room to change for anyone willing to listen. A week later, the morning at Willow Creek Ferry Terminal carried the soft hush of winter, settling deeper into the season. Snow hadn't come yet, but the sky held that quiet promise, pale and thoughtful. Walt Hensley stepped inside with a small parcel tucked neatly under his arm, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a bit of twine. He moved with the same unhurried grace as always, boots tapping lightly against the floor. The terminal looked different now. Not brighter exactly, but warmer, as though the building itself had remembered something it had forgotten for years. Near the main entrance, just beyond the ticket window, a new plaque hung on the wall. The brass plate caught the overhead light in a steady glow. To Walter Hensley, who served quietly so others could live. Walt paused in front of it for a moment. His expression didn't change much, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there the last time he stood in this room. People walking through the lobby slowed down to look at him, not with curiosity this time, but with quiet respect. Near the far end of the lobby stood Henry Mason, the Admiral, hands folded behind his back, posture still sharp even in retirement. His silver hair caught the morning light. When Walt met his gaze, the Admiral offered him a single nod, deep and steady, the kind men give when no further words are needed. Noah hurried in a moment later, coat unzipped, cheeks flushed from the cold. He spotted Walt instantly and ran over holding something tightly in his fist. "Sir, you left your coin last time." Walt looked at the boy, then at the small brass coin resting in Noah's open hand. The edges were worn, the symbols along its rim still clear. Walt didn't take it back right away. Instead, he rested a gentle hand on Noah's shoulder. "Take care of people," he said quietly. "That's all any of us can do." Noah nodded, absorbing the words the way young people do when they realize an adult has given them something important. He closed his fingers around the coin as though protecting a small flame. Walt gave him one more soft smile, then turned toward the doors leading out to the dock. The river wind slipped through the entrance as it opened, carrying the faint scent of brine and the distant churn of water against the ferry's hull. Somewhere out on the water, a gull cried its voice, thin and drifting. Walt stepped outside, coat brushing gently against his legs as he made his way toward the edge of the pier. The harbor stretched out before him, gray and familiar, its tides moving with the patient rhythm of an old friend. He walked away the way only a quiet old veteran could, steady, humble, the kind of silence even old sailors remember. Without a word. The wind carried his footsteps into the distance, soft and unassuming, until they blended with the roll of the tide. If this story moved, you share it forward. A week later, as the ferry bell drifted across the cold harbor, Walt paused beneath the new brass plaque and felt the kind of quiet gratitude that settles in like a lamp glowing in a winter window. Still, he handed his small parcel to the clerk with the same steady kindness as before, never asking for recognition and simply nodding when neighbors thanked him for what he'd once carried alone. Then Noah caught up and pressed the service coin into his palm, and Walt rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, reminding him that caring for people is the truest sort of hero's work. And he walked out toward the dock, the way only a quiet old veteran could, steady, humble, the kind of silence even old sailors remember. Without a word.